You wake up to the sound of soft sobs reverberating through the marble corridors. But the sorrow isn't for the late pharaoh lying in his golden tomb. It's for the living soul, barely able to move, whose face is so deformed that servants must feed him like an infant. His body trembles with fits, which the court doctors attribute to divine possession. The year is 1323 BC, and you're standing in the shadowed halls of the palace, watching 18-year-old Tutankhamun struggle to lift his ceremonial crook and flail. His sister-wife Anka'an supports his arm, her own face showing the unmistakable traits of their shared bloodline, an elongated skull, protruding teeth and hollow eyes, the result of generations of royal marriages between siblings. The air is thick with the scent of frankincense and the weight of fear. Court officials exchange furtive glances, silently hoping the gods do not notice. Everyone knows what is unspeakable. The divine bloodline of the pharaohs has become toxic within them. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival and hardship, don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoy uncovering hidden truths of history. Subscribe for more content like this, and feel free to share where you're listening from in the comments. It's incredible how we're connecting across time and space, exploring these ancient stories from different parts of the world. The ancient Egyptians believed their pharaohs were living gods, blessed with divine blood that set them apart from ordinary people. To preserve this sacred essence, they practiced what was called royal marriage, unions between siblings, half-siblings, and close relatives to concentrate divine blood in their children. This practice helped create some of history's most powerful rulers, but it also led to some of the most tragic genetic consequences. Tenton's withered left foot drags behind him as he approaches the throne room. Modern DNA tests would later show that his parents were full siblings, and their son inherited a cocktail of harmful genetic traits, a cleft palate, a club foot, feminine hips, and a spine so crooked that standing up straight required immense effort. But in 1323 BC, these physical deformities were seen as divine tests, mysterious burdens that proved his godliness rather than signs of a biological disaster. The practice of royal incest wasn't born out of perversion or ignorance. It emerged from a complex theological system that viewed the pharaoh as the earthly embodiment of the god Horus. Just as the gods married their siblings, Osiris wed his sister Isis, Set married his sister Nephis, so too must their descendants preserve the purity of their divine bloodline. Marrying outside the royal family would dilute this sacred blood, weakening the pharaoh's connection to the gods and disrupting the cosmic order that ensured the Nile flooded and the sun rose each day. The first recorded instance of royal sibling marriage occurred during the 4th dynasty, around 2550 BC, when Pharaoh Jedefia married his sister Hetepheres II. But it wasn't until the New Kingdom period, between 1550 and 1070 BC, that sibling marriage became not just accepted but required. Pharaohs like Amenhotep III, Arenatan, and Tutankhamun turned this practice into a political necessity, concentrating power within a single bloodline to prevent rival families from challenging their rule. The theological justification for these marriages was deeply embedded in Egyptian culture. The creation myth of Heliopolis explained how the god Tum created the world through masturbation, giving birth to the twin gods Shu and Tefnut, who then mated to create Geb and Nut. Their children, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, were siblings who paired off to continue the divine lineage, setting a precedent for royal incest. The pharaohs weren't just following tradition, they were reenacting the foundational creation story of their civilization. This divine rationale became so ingrained in Egyptian kingship that refusing to marry within the royal family was considered an act of sacrilege. When Amenhotep I briefly considered marrying a foreign princess in 1400 BC, the high priests of Thebes threatened to declare him unfit to rule. The divine status of the pharaoh depended entirely on the purity of his bloodline, and any foreign contamination would sever his connection to the gods. The boy, who would ascend to the throne as pharaoh at the age of 9, was born with a combination of conditions that should have been impossible to survive in the ancient world. His mere existence was a testament to the advanced medical knowledge of Egyptian doctors who managed to keep him alive despite his significant genetic disadvantages. The court physicians of the 18th dynasty developed complex treatments for the genetic disorders that afflicted each generation of pharaohs. Papyrus scrolls from that time detail intricate surgical procedures, including attempts to correct cleft palates and club feet. The Edwin Smith papyrus, dating back to around 1600 BC, contains detailed descriptions of neurological conditions that align with the symptoms of several inbred pharaohs. These medical texts show that Egyptian doctors understood the link between royal marriages and genetic defects, even though they couldn't explain it in modern terms. One papyrus from the reign of Amenhotep III notes the curse of the divine blood, highlighting how royal children often face similar physical ailments. The physicians had a sophisticated system for classifying these disorders, recognizing patterns that would not be scientifically understood until the rise of modern genetics. The mummy of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, tells a story of suffering that was carefully concealed by the artists. His skull shows signs of hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid builds up in the brain, leading to severe headaches and cognitive issues. His chest cavity is partially collapsed, suggesting severe scoliosis that would have made breathing difficult and painful. His left foot is so deformed that over 100 walking sticks were found in his tomb, ranging from simple wooden canes to ornate golden staffs meant to support his weight. Chemical analysis of his mummy revealed that he had been embalmed in a hurry, with significant damage to his body, possibly even from burns before mummification. This suggests that his death was sudden and unexpected, despite his ongoing health struggles. The embalmer's haste to preserve his body may have been driven by concerns that his genetic disorders would continue to show even after his death. The circumstances surrounding the young pharaoh's death at 18 remain mysterious, but modern forensic analysis has revealed unsettling details about his final days. CT scans of his skull reveal a blow to the back of his head that could have been fatal. His ribs show fractures consistent with a chariot accident or a fall from a great height. Chemical analysis of his organs revealed high levels of antimony, a poison commonly used in ancient Egypt for both medicinal and lethal purposes. This evidence suggests that Tutankhamun may have been murdered, possibly by courtiers who had grown weary of being ruled by a frail king. His genetic weaknesses made him an easy target for those who wished to see him removed. The boy king, who had defied all biological odds, ultimately fell victim to the political consequences of his genetic legacy. However, Tutankhamun's tragic story was just the beginning. The true genetic disaster in ancient Egypt would unfold centuries later, when Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy I conquered Egypt in 305 BC and established a dynasty that would make the pharaoh's sibling marriages seem restrained in comparison. The Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt from 305 to 30 BC, elevated royal incest to an art form. Over nearly 3 centuries, they produced 15 generations of rulers who married their sisters, brothers, daughters, and nieces with such consistency that their family tree resembled more of a genetic spiral than a branching lineage. The Ptolemies didn't just practice incest, they institutionalized it, creating a system of royal marriage more closed than any other dynasty in human history. Unlike the pharaohs, who justified their sibling unions through Egyptian theology, the Ptolemies practiced incest for strictly political reasons. As Macedonian Greeks ruling over a conquered Egyptian population, they needed to maintain their Greek heritage while claiming legitimacy as pharaohs. Marrying within their own family served both purposes. It preserved their Macedonian bloodline while also adopting the Egyptian royal tradition of sibling marriage. Ptolemy I, the dynasty's founder, was one of Alexander's most trusted generals and a shrewd politician who understood the delicate balance required to rule Egypt. Initially, he seemed to reject the Egyptian practice of royal incest, but as his reign progressed, he recognized the political advantages of closed marriages. His son, Ptolemy II, fully embraced the practice, setting a precedent that would define the dynasty for the next 3 centuries. Ptolemy II, who ruled from 283 to 246 BC, set the model for Ptolemaic incest when he divorced his first wife Arsinoe to marry his full sister Arsinoe II. This wasn't a political marriage or a theological requirement. It was a deliberate decision to concentrate royal blood in his heirs. The marriage was celebrated with grand ceremonies that blended Greek and Egyptian traditions, creating a new royal ritual that would be repeated for generations. This union was politically successful. Arsinoe II proved to be an effective co-ruler, helping to expand Ptolemaic power across the Mediterranean. She was deified after her death, and her cult became one of the most popular in the ancient world. The political triumph of this sibling marriage led subsequent Ptolemies to believe that incest was not just permissible, but essential for dynastic survival. The commitment of the Ptolemies to sibling marriage was so unwavering that they often married multiple siblings in a row, Ptolemy VII, who ruled from 70 to 116 BC, married his sister Cleopatra II. After her death, he then wed her daughter Cleopatra III, his own niece. When Cleopatra III passed away, he married her daughter Cleopatra IV, making him not only her uncle, but also her stepfather and husband all at once. These repeated marriages weren't uncommon in Ptolemaic Egypt, they were the standard. The sheer precision of their inbreeding was staggering. Geneticists have calculated that by the time Cleopatra III, the famous Cleopatra who captivated Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, came to power, the royal family had intermarried for so long that she had only 6 unique ancestors in her family tree, going back 5 generations. Normally, she would have had 32 distinct ancestors over the same span of time. The Ptolemies had reduced their genetic diversity to less than 20% of what it should have been. This genetic bottleneck was the result of careful planning by Ptolemaic rulers who saw their bloodline as a precious resource that had to be preserved. They devised elaborate marriage contracts that not only outlined who could marry whom, but also specified how many children each couple should have and in what order. These contracts, preserved on papyrus scrolls discovered in the Fayum region, reveal a dynasty obsessed with genetic purity to the point of mathematical precision. The physical effects of this genetic bottleneck were catastrophic. Ptolemaic rulers suffered from a variety of disorders that worsened with each generation. Contemporary accounts describe pharaohs plagued by severe obesity, mental instability, and physical deformities that made them barely recognizable as human. The historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, referred to the Ptolemaic court as a menagerie of human monstrosities disguised as gods. Ptolemy VI was so grotesquely overweight that his subjects nicknamed him Physcon, meaning pot-belly. Estimated to weigh over 400 pounds, he was unable to walk unaided. He needed a team of servants to help him move around his palace, and his throne had to be specially reinforced to support his immense weight. Contemporary records describe him as constantly sweating, breathing heavily, and needing frequent breaks for even the simplest tasks. His obesity was just one symptom of a broader metabolic disorder that affected many generations of Ptolemies. Modern geneticists have identified several genetic mutations that could explain the dynasty's tendency toward extreme weight gain. These mutations also affected fertility, making it difficult for the rulers to produce healthy heirs, which contributed to the eventual extinction of the dynasty. The psychological toll of inbreeding was equally devastating. Several Ptolemaic rulers displayed what modern psychiatrists would diagnose as severe personality disorders. Ptolemy IV, who ruled from 221 to 204 BC, was described by contemporary historians as paranoid and sadistic. He murdered his mother, brother, and uncle in a single purge, believing they were conspiring against him. He then married his sister, Arsinoe III, and forced her to participate in increasingly bizarre religious rituals that contemporary observers described as signs of divine madness. His paranoia became so extreme that he refused to eat food that hadn't been tested by multiple tasters. He slept in a different room each night and employed a network of spies to monitor his own family members. His behavior grew so erratic that even his ministers began to question his sanity. One contemporary account describes him as a man haunted by demons of his own making. Ptolemy IV's mental instability may have been caused by temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can arise from the genetic disorders common in inbred populations. The condition leads to seizures that can manifest as religious visions, paranoid delusions, and violent outbursts. Other Ptolemaic rulers exhibited similar symptoms, suggesting that this form of epilepsy was endemic in the royal bloodline. The Ptolemies' court physicians became experts in managing the medical consequences of royal inbreeding. They developed intricate treatments for the genetic disorders that plagued each generation, special diets for the morbidly obese pharaohs, mechanical devices to assist the physically impaired rulers in walking, and potions to calm the psychological disorders that sometimes made them dangerous to themselves and others. These medical treatments were recorded in detail on papyrus scrolls, showcasing the sophistication of Ptolemaic medicine. The physicians understood that the royal genetic disorders were hereditary, even if they couldn't explain the mechanisms of inheritance. They devised a system of medical surveillance that tracked the health of royal children from birth, identifying genetic issues early and developing strategies to manage them. One particularly detailed medical papyrus describes the treatment of Ptolemy IX, who suffered from severe haemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. the physicians devised a complex regimen of herbal remedies, dietary restrictions, and physical therapy to minimize the risk of bleeding. They also created specially designed clothing and furniture to protect the king from injuries that could prove fatal. However, the physicians couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Each generation of Ptolemies was genetically weaker than the last. The dynasty's later rulers became increasingly dependent on their advisors, ministers, and foreign allies to maintain power. The royal bloodline that had once ruled Egypt was slowly destroying itself from within, creating a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by Rome. The political consequences of the Ptolemies' genetic decline were far-reaching. As the pharaohs grew physically and mentally weaker, true power shifted to court officials, military leaders, and foreign advisors. The traditional Egyptian system of divine kingship, which had ensured stability for over 3,000 years, began to crumble under the burden of genetic ruin. The most famous victim of Ptolemaic inbreeding was also its most successful survivor. Cleopatra III, who became pharaoh in 51 BC, was the result of 11 generations of sibling marriage. Her parents were full siblings, her grandparents were full siblings, and her great-grandparents were also full siblings. By any biological standard, she should have been a genetic disaster. Instead, she emerged as one of history's most formidable rulers. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages, was highly educated in mathematics and philosophy, and commanded one of the ancient world's most powerful armies. She brokered treaties with Rome, managed Egypt's complex economy, and maintained the loyalty of her people despite the political turmoil that surrounded her reign. Yet, even Cleopatra could not escape the genetic burden of her ancestry. Historical accounts describe her as having an enlarged head, protruding teeth, and a deep masculine voice, traits commonly associated with inbreeding. Her intellect and charisma may have masked physical deformities, but those who met her in person would have noticed them. Roman sources describe Cleopatra as physically unattractive but intellectually captivating. The image of Cleopatra as a stunning beauty, often depicted in countless works of art and literature, was likely more the result of Roman propaganda than truth. The iconic portrayal of Cleopatra as a seductive temptress was crafted by Roman poets and artists to explain how she captivated their greatest leaders. The historical Cleopatra was probably not conventionally beautiful, but her political acumen and intellectual capabilities made her irresistible to powerful men. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were more political alliances than romantic entanglements. Caesar needed Egyptian grain and gold to fund his military campaigns, while Cleopatra sought Roman protection to secure her throne. Their affair produced a son, Caesarion, who inherited his mother's intelligence but also her genetic disadvantages. The boy grew up physically weak and mentally unstable, unfit to rule either Egypt or Rome. Similarly, Mark Antony's relationship with Cleopatra was pragmatic. The Roman general needed Egyptian resources for his war against Octavian, while Cleopatra needed Roman military support to retain her power. Their union resulted in 3 children, all of whom displayed signs of genetic disorders that would have made them unfit to rule. The end of the Ptolemaic dynasty did not come from genetic collapse, but from military defeat. In 31 BC, Octavian's forces defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. The outcome was not decided by superior tactics or strategy, but by the defection of Cleopatra's fleet, whose commanders had grown weary of supporting a genetically weakened dynasty. Rather than face capture and the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a trophy, Cleopatra chose to end her life. She died in August of 30 BC at the age of 39, marking the end of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Her death symbolized the conclusion of the last great experiment in royal incest, putting an end to a genetic disaster that had persisted for over a millennium. The aftermath of Cleopatra's death revealed the full extent of the Ptolemaic genetic catastrophe. Octavian's forces found that the royal treasury was nearly empty, despite Egypt's vast wealth. The genetic disorders of the pharaohs had made them incapable of effective governance, and their kingdom had slowly crumbled under mismanagement and neglect. The royal palaces were filled with signs of the dynasty's decline. Rooms once used for grand ceremonies had been repurposed as medical facilities for treating royal genetic disorders. The famous Library of Alexandria, once the greatest centre of learning in the ancient world, had been left to decay as successive pharaohs became too mentally unstable to appreciate its value. With Cleopatra's death, the final chapter of royal incest in Egypt came to a close. The Ptolemies had demonstrated that a genetically closed royal family could hold power for centuries, but only at a tremendous biological cost. Each generation paid a steeper price for the privilege of maintaining pure blood, until the dynasty's greatest ruler chose death over witnessing the extinction of her line. The genetic consequences of royal incest were not unique to Egypt. Throughout the ancient world, ruling families practiced various forms of cousin marriage, sibling marriage, and dynastic intermarriage. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which ruled from 550 to 380 BC, also practiced sibling marriage within its royal family. The Seleucid Empire, which controlled much of the former Persian Empire after Alexander's death, encouraged marriages between close relatives as well. But nowhere was the practice as systematic or as catastrophic as in Egypt. The Ptolemies and their dynasty created the most genetically isolated royal bloodlines in human history, and their dynasties paid the ultimate price for this biological experiment. Their genetic failures serve as a warning about the dangers of closed breeding systems and highlight the importance of genetic diversity for human survival. The story of Egypt's inbred rulers has gained new relevance in modern times, as geneticists have come to understand the full extent of the damage caused by royal incest. DNA analysis of pharaonic mummies has revealed genetic disorders far more severe than previously imagined. These discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of ancient Egyptian history and the biological factors that influenced one of the world's greatest civilizations. The legacy of royal inbreeding extended far beyond the deaths of individual pharaohs. The genetic catastrophe that plagued Egypt's ruling families sent shockwaves that would reshape the ancient world and influence the course of human history for millennia. When Octavian finally entered Alexandria in 30 BC, his soldiers discovered a treasure trove of medical records that revealed the full extent of the Ptolemaic genetic disaster. The royal physicians had meticulously documented every birth defect, every failed pregnancy, every premature death that had afflicted the dynasty over 3 centuries. These papyrus scrolls, written in both Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphs, provided the first comprehensive record of the effects of sustained inbreeding on a population. The Roman physician Galen, who visited Alexandria in 162 AD, extensively studied these records and incorporated their findings into his own medical writings. His treatises on hereditary diseases, influenced partly by the Ptolemaic medical texts, would shape European medicine for over 1,000 years. The genetic disasters of ancient Egypt inadvertently contributed to the development of medical science, as physicians grappled with the consequences of royal incest. However, the most profound impact of Egyptian royal inbreeding was its effect on the institution of kingship itself. The collapse of the pharaonic system showed that divine blood alone was not enough to sustain a dynasty. The Romans, who took control of Egypt, adopted a vastly different approach to imperial succession. Rather than relying on hereditary monarchy, they created a system of adoption, allowing emperors to choose their successors based on merit rather than bloodline. Augustus, the Roman emperor who defeated Cleopatra, was keenly aware of the dangers of hereditary rule. Having witnessed firsthand how genetic defects had weakened the Ptolemies and made them vulnerable to conquest, he decided to establish the Julio-Claudian dynasty. This was achieved through a combination of blood relations and strategic adoptions, preserving political continuity while avoiding the genetic pitfalls that had destroyed Egypt's pharaohs. Yet even the Romans couldn't completely escape the temptation of royal incest. Emperor Caligula, who reigned from 37 to 41 AD, was rumoured to have had incestuous relationships with his sisters. His erratic behaviour, including declaring himself a god and naming his horse a consul, may have been influenced by the genetic disorders present in the Julio-Claudian family line. His assassination after just 4 years on the throne demonstrated that even Rome's sophisticated political system couldn't protect a ruler with such genetic flaws. After Caligula's death, his successor, Claudius, commissioned a detailed study of the fallen Egyptian dynasties. This research, conducted by the historian Manetho the Younger, produced the first in-depth analysis of how royal incest had contributed to the fall of pharaonic power. Their findings were so alarming that Claudius ordered most copies to be destroyed, fearing they might fuel republican sentiments by exposing the weaknesses of hereditary monarchy. The surviving fragments of Manetho's work provide chilling details about the final generations of the 18th dynasty. He describes pharaohs who were so physically deformed that they could only appear in public while wearing elaborate masks and ceremonial garb designed to hide their disabilities. One passage describes Tutankhamun's immediate predecessor, Smenkhkare, as a king whose voice was a whisper and whose walk resembled that of a crippled child. His very presence was said to cause his subjects to avert their gaze in shame. The historian also recorded the elaborate lies used to maintain the illusion of pharaonic divinity. Court artists were required to idolize the appearance of rulers, creating portraits that bore no resemblance to reality. Statues and paintings portrayed pharaohs as perfect human specimens, while in truth, these rulers struggled with severe disabilities that made basic tasks like walking and speaking difficult. These artistic deceptions became so ingrained in Egyptian culture that they influenced the development of Egyptian art for centuries. The famous golden death mask of Tutankhamun, with its flawless features and peaceful expression, represents the apex of this tradition, a beautiful lie designed to conceal a tragic reality. The religious implications of royal incest were equally profound. The fall of the pharaonic system challenged fundamental Egyptian beliefs about the divine nature of kingship. If the pharaohs were truly gods, how could their bloodline be so frail? If royal incest was sanctioned by the gods, why did it produce such devastating results? These questions ignited theological debates that persisted for centuries and ultimately played a role in the decline of traditional Egyptian religion. The priesthood found itself in an untenable position. For millennia they had taught that pharaonic incest was not only permissible but necessary to maintain cosmic balance. Yet the genetic collapse of the royal bloodlines forced them to come up with increasingly convoluted explanations for why the gods would allow their earthly representatives to suffer such afflictions. Some priests argued that the genetic disorders were divine tests, trials that proved the pharaoh's godhood by demonstrating their ability to overcome physical limitations. Others suggested that the afflictions were divine punishments for unknown sins, cosmic justice for transgressions that could not be understood by mere mortals. These theological contortions became increasingly desperate as the evidence of genetic catastrophe became impossible to ignore. The Egyptian creation myth itself began to be questioned. If Osiris and Isis had established the divine precedent for sibling marriage, why were their royal descendants facing such devastating consequences? Some radical priests proposed that the gods had withdrawn their blessing from the royal bloodline, while others suggested that the traditional creation story had been misinterpreted by earlier generations of theologians. This crisis of faith sparked the rise of alternative religious movements in ancient Egypt. The cult of Serapis, introduced by the early Ptolemies, gained traction, partly because it offered a different model of divinity that did not rely on bloodline inheritance. Similarly, the increasing influence of Greek philosophy among Egyptian intellectuals provided rational explanations for natural phenomena that had previously been attributed to divine will. The medical consequences of royal incest also had far-reaching effects on Egyptian society. The elaborate treatments developed for genetically compromised pharaohs led to significant advances in surgical techniques, pharmacology, and anatomical knowledge. Egyptian physicians became the most skilled in the ancient world, partly because they had to treat genetic disorders that were rare in other civilizations. The medical papyri documenting treatments for royal genetic disorders offer invaluable insights into ancient medical practices. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, which describes surgical procedures for treating head injuries, may have been partly written to address the neurological issues that plagued the inbred pharaohs. The Ebers Papyrus, which contains over 700 medical treatments, includes numerous remedies for genetic disorders that were common in the royal family. These medical advances had unintended benefits for Egyptian society. Techniques developed to treat royal genetic disorders were eventually applied to the general population, leading to improvements in public health that helped Egypt maintain its position as the most prosperous civilization in the ancient world. The irony is that the genetic disasters of the royal family inadvertently benefited the very people who were forced to worship these physically flawed rulers as living gods. The economic impact of royal incest was equally significant. The vast resources required to manage genetically compromised pharaohs drained wealth away from crucial investments in infrastructure, agriculture, and trade. The Ptolemaic dynasty spent enormous sums on medical treatments, specialized equipment, and court accommodations for rulers who were barely able to govern. Financial records from the Ptolemaic era, preserved on papyrus scrolls found at Oxyrhynchus, reveal the staggering costs of maintaining an inbred royal family. Ptolemy VI's medical expenses alone consumed nearly 10% of the kingdom's annual revenue. The dynasty spent huge amounts on custom-made furniture, specialized clothing, and mechanical devices designed to help physically disabled rulers perform their ceremonial duties. As the dynasty's genetic problems worsened, the economic strain became even more severe. Later Ptolemaic rulers required teams of servants to help with basic tasks like eating, walking, and speaking clearly during public events. The royal household grew exponentially, as each new generation of pharaohs needed more assistance to maintain the illusion of divine competence. These financial pressures led to political instability that ultimately contributed to the downfall of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Heavy taxes to cover royal medical expenses sparked numerous uprisings among Egyptian peasants and city dwellers. The dynasty's failure to invest in military technology and infrastructure left Egypt vulnerable to foreign invasions. The psychological effects of royal incest extended far beyond the immediate royal family. Court officials who served genetically compromised pharaohs developed elaborate coping mechanisms to manage the cognitive dissonance of worshipping visibly flawed rulers as divine beings. Many courtiers suffered from symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as chronic stress and anxiety disorders. Contemporary accounts describe the surreal atmosphere that permeated the royal courts of inbred dynasties. Courtiers were required to uphold the fiction of pharaonic divinity while observing daily evidence of royal genetic disorders. This led to a culture of deception and willful ignorance that permeated every aspect of palace life. The memoirs of Demetrius the Cynic, a Greek philosopher who served at the Ptolemaic court in the 2nd century BC, offer rare insights into the psychological toll of serving an inbred dynasty. He describes the elaborate protocols used to hide royal disabilities, including scripted interactions that allowed mentally impaired pharaohs to appear competent during public audiences. Demetrius also documents the paranoia and fear that characterized life in the palace under genetically compromised rulers. Courtiers lived in constant dread of accidentally revealing the true extent of royal disabilities. Those who witnessed pharaonic seizures, incontinence, or other embarrassing symptoms were often executed to preserve the illusion of divine perfection. The impact of royal incest on ancient Egyptian art and architecture was profound and enduring. The need to conceal genetic disorders led to the development of highly stylized artistic conventions that influenced Egyptian culture for millennia. Sculptors and painters created an idealized visual language that bore no resemblance to the physical reality of the royal family. The famous colossal statues of pharaohs, with their perfect proportions and serene expressions, were in fact sophisticated propaganda designed to counteract the visible evidence of genetic deterioration. The more physically compromised a pharaoh was, the more idealized his artistic representations became. This inverse relationship between physical reality and artistic representation resulted in some of the most beautiful and psychologically intricate art in human history. The architectural legacy of royal incest is equally fascinating. Many of Egypt's most famous monuments were designed to accommodate the physical limitations of genetically compromised pharaohs. The gentle ramps and expansive corridors in many royal tombs were designed to accommodate disabled rulers, allowing them to access their final resting places. The complex mechanical devices discovered within the pharaonic burial chambers may have been intended as assistive tools rather than religious artifacts. The Great Pyramid of Giza, long considered the ultimate symbol of pharaonic power, might have actually been a desperate effort to project strength in the face of genetic weakness. The pyramid's immense scale and flawless proportions created a powerful visual statement of divine authority, compensating for the physical frailty of the pharaohs who commissioned it. Royal incest also affected the international reputation of ancient Egypt. Foreign diplomats and traders who visited the pharaonic courts were often appalled by the clear genetic disorders they observed among the royal family. These observations contributed to the growing skepticism of other civilizations toward Egypt's divine kingship, eventually diminishing Egypt's influence on the global stage. Diplomatic records from the Amarna archives reveal the increasing cynicism of foreign rulers regarding Egyptian pharaohs. One letter from the Hittite king Sublumu Amenhotep IV ridicules the pharaoh's physical appearance, calling him the god king who speaks like a woman and walks like a child. Such insults would have been unthinkable in earlier times, when Egyptian pharaohs commanded true respect from their international peers. The decline of Egypt's military power was closely tied to the genetic deterioration of the royal bloodline. Pharaohs who could barely walk were incapable of leading their armies into battle, forcing them to depend more and more on foreign mercenaries and allied forces. This weakness made Egypt vulnerable to conquest and eventually led to the loss of its independence. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC, which ended Ptolemaic rule, was as much a biological disaster as it was a military defeat. Cleopatra's forces included many Egyptian soldiers who had lost faith in their genetically compromised queen. The defection of her fleet reflected the broader collapse of loyalty among her people, as they could no longer believe in the divine nature of their rulers. The Roman conquest of Egypt marked the end of the longest experiment in royal incest the world had ever known. However, it also preserved invaluable evidence of the consequences of that experiment. Roman administrators who took control of Egyptian archives found thousands of documents that detailed the medical, economic, and political effects of sustained inbreeding. These records influenced Roman imperial policy for centuries and provided modern historians with unparalleled insights into the genetics of ancient royalty. The story of Egypt's inbred rulers serves as a potent reminder of the biological realities that underpin human civilization. No matter how advanced a culture becomes, it cannot escape the fundamental laws of genetics. The pharaohs and Ptolemies believed their royal blood made them superior to ordinary humans, but their commitment to genetic purity ultimately led to their downfall. The weeping that echoed through the marble corridors of Thebes on the day Tutankhamun died wasn't just mourning for a fallen king, it was the sound of a genetic catastrophe reaching its tragic conclusion, a bloodline that had been slowly destroying itself for over 1,000 years. In their pursuit of divinity, the pharaohs had lost sight of what it meant to remain human, and in the end, that loss cost them everything. Their legacy lives on, not in the divine blood they sought to preserve, but in the cautionary tale they left behind. A warning about the dangers of genetic arrogance that still resonates today, just as it did 3,000 years ago in the shadow of the pyramids.